Okay. Travis, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, sure. I can go ahead and get started. So thank you for coming out, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about sabers, and specifically, what I want to look at today is all sabers. So this is kind of going to be like a saber 101, but not in the way most people would typically mean that. A lot of the time, saber fencing is studied through its application in 19th century Europe, but I believe in order to understand the saber's proper place within historical European martial arts and world history in general, you have to not only study other time periods of saber fencing within Europe, but also look at how the saber came to Europe and how it was influenced while it was in Europe, because the saber was a weapon that was influenced by a lot of outside forces, which isn't necessarily the same as some other weapons. Something like the longsword, right? It's pretty typical of Europe, of Germany and Italy, and it saw a lot of development there, but there wasn't a lot of very similar analogs from other cultures that it interacted with that had very clear direct impacts on how that weapon's form and style developed. But that is the case with the saber. So I think it's an important factor that we look at, and that's kind of the goal of the lecture today. Um, so first off, what is a saber? Like, what am I counting as a saber for today's lesson? Um, in a nutshell, the word saber really just means curve. So you could argue that any curved sword is a saber. However, for the sake of this particular lesson, I am only going to count one-handed curved swords of approximately 2.5 to 3.5 feet in length. The reason I'm specifying a little bit more is I'm trying to not look at what you could just argue is technically a saber, but what had similar influences between it. So, for example, what led to the two-handed Japanese katana is a little bit different than what led to the Persian shamshir. They had different influences that were causing the weapon to evolve in the way that it did, and also to be fought with the way that it did. So I kind of want to be able to pull a bit of a narrative out of this. So we're going to look at all things that strictly fall under this definition of saber in this group. Also, the hilt is completely irrelevant to whether or not it is a saber. So if you see on the far right picture here, we have what looks to be a typical saber hilt, what you would typically associate with a saber, but the blade is 100% straight. This is what is actually called a palish. It is a type of cavalry sword. So regardless of the hilt, even if you take two swords with the exact same hilt, if one of them has a curved blade and the other one doesn't, only one is a saber. And then, of course, there's going to be different types of sabers that we're going to be talking about too, shamshirs, killages, all that stuff, but it's all going to fall under our saber umbrella. So some of the earliest records we have of sabers come from the 6th to 9th century in Eastern Europe in the Avars. So the Avars were a nomadic group who settled in Eastern Europe around the middle of the 6th century, and there was a lot of migration happening during this time period, not just in Europe, but around the entire world, where you had a lot of nomadic groups who were traveling around and settling in different places, and you had the Avars come into some typically considered European regions around that time. There isn't a whole lot known about the Avars. Their history is pretty obscure, which you're going to see is a common factor for some of these nomadic groups. But we do know that they had sabers, and they practiced them in a style of cavalry warfare. So we have a few example of Avar saber finds on the left here. As you can see, these sabers are pretty thin, proportionate to their length. Not terribly curved, although they all definitely have a curve to them. They have these very small crossguard, typically upswept. You see those little balls on the end of it a lot too. And then in the handle and the pommel, you can see a cant. In other words, the handle kind of dips away from the blade a little bit. Now, you could argue that these these guards weren't actually to protect the hand at all. When you start getting very small guards like this, you see the same thing on some messers. It might not even be a form of hand protection so much as it's just a way to stop the hand from jamming up the blade when you hit something and actually cutting yourself. So very, very diminutive hand protection on these, arguably none to speak of at all. But we do know at least that they were used from horseback a lot of the time, although we don't really know much about the specific application of their use. Very similar to the Avar Sabres, we have the Magyar Sabres. The Magyars were another nomadic group who arrived in a lot of the regions that had been settled by the Avars and founded what is modern-day Hungary. Well, not modern-day Hungary, but it was called Hungary and it became modern-day Hungary over time. They used sabers that were very, very similar to the Avar Sabres, as you can see, although they tend to be a little bit more complex in a few ways. The top right example here, you can actually see a fuller of the blade, which is a very common characteristic of sabers from pretty much here on out. Not all sabers, but you at least see the fullering of the saber starting to take place here, which isn't as common with some of the Avar saber finds. And then you can see on this very pretty example here, I wanted to include this one, even though it might be an Avar saber or might be a Magyar saber. It was kind of a coin toss which slide I put it on, but it's the best preserved find we have from this era, and it's typically called the saber of Charlemagne. Now, did it actually belong to Charlemagne? Probably not. The story goes it was recovered from his tomb about 150 years after his death, but it's anybody's best guess whether it belonged to him in life or was in his tomb in death or had absolutely no association with him whatsoever. What I do want to say about this saber is it has a yeoman. It's a little bit hard to see from this angle, but right around here, it actually steps up on the spine and it's sharp all the way up here on the back of the sword. So while a saber is typically thought of as being a single-edged sword, almost every saber in world history has some degree of back edge. It's just not usually the entire spine. I'd say on average, you get sabers that have a front edge and then a blunt spine for the first 2/3, and then you get a sharp edge on the back for the last third. And if this sharp edge on the back actually steps out and gets broader than the rest of the saber up until then it's called a yeoman. Typically, swords with yeomans are going to prioritize use of that back edge too. They're going to have a lot of techniques that involve it. And here we have a depiction of a Magyar horseman. You're definitely going to notice here that he has a recurve bow of some sort, and he is doing the classic Parthian shot, rotating around in the saddle and firing an arrow behind you. This is definitely what you think of when you think of nomadic style of warfare, right? They're going to be on the horse, harassing the enemy, trying to string them out, and firing arrows in a very mobile style. So it's interesting that all the way back in this time period, we see sabers being associated with people who are practicing warfare in this manner, even if we don't really know exactly what form the swordplay itself took. Around the same time, we start seeing sabers mostly in Byzantine art. And I say mostly in the art because we don't have a lot of, if any, physical finds of them. This antique that I put in here may or may not be an actual Byzantine saber. A auction house was listing it as such, but that's pretty dubious. That kind of just trusts that the auction house actually knew what they had on their hand. Although I will say, if you see this little step up in the guard here on this painting on the right, that is something you see a lot on artwork of the Byzantine sabers, and the saber does appear to have one of those, kind of like a little proto-langet. And you don't see those on the Avar and the Magyar sabers. Typically, you don't get any lankets at all. It's just the crossguard. So the fact that this antique has lankets, maybe it's a Byzantine saber. I don't really know. Hopefully they were right. That would be cool, but I just wanted to give that disclaimer. And the Byzantine sabers are also sometimes called paramarians, and paramarian means to be worn at the thigh or at the hip. There's some theories about what that might mean. Maybe it was meant to be the way the cavalry wore it was hanging at the hip. I don't really know. I think that's pretty speculative. I've heard that theory tossed around a few times that it indicates it was for cavalry use, but I think at the thigh could mean a lot of things. Most swords were worn around there, so take from that what you will. So this next slide, I kind of wanted to talk about a little bit of a misconception with sabers. there is this idea that the saber came from the Middle East to Europe, and a lot of times it's associated with the Crusades. I've heard a lot of like very, not well researched thought pieces come out like, oh, the Crusaders encountered Middle Eastern Shamshirs and stuff and then brought them back to Europe. And basically all of that is wrong. During the first three Crusades, most of the Islamic forces at the time were using straight swords. They were using straight double-edged swords, and you can see a couple examples of them here. They're a little different in the grip region, especially to what was being used in Europe, but these blades look very, very similar to European arming swords at the time. They're broad, not a lot of profile taper, pretty spatulated points. They don't come to very fine armor-piercing points. These are broad, double-edged cutting swords, and that was very, very similar to what was being used in Europe at the time. Now, I'm going to put a little asterisk by that and say they also had steppe nomads coming in to the Middle East at the time. So here is an example of one of those. This often gets called a Turco-Mongolic proto-saber. Call it whatever you want, but it's the type of saber that we were seeing with the Avars and the Magyars, and you can also have finds of these from Turkey and the Middle East at the time of the early Crusades. So it seems like these swords were present, but they were not particularly common within a lot of the early Islamic forces. Even if they had militaries that might have some contingents who would carry the saber, it wouldn't exactly be common. And I think that's kind of a similar line you can draw with Europe, how there might be sabers there in this time period, but they're not the norm and they're not common. If you asked for an example of a average European sword from this year, it would not be a saber, and the same is true for the Middle East. I also just wanted to have this map here because I've been talking about the steppes a lot. So as you can see, the steppes are basically this big grass sea that stretch all the way from Mongolia and Manchuria to Hungary. And they also spread out a little bit into the Middle East. So you can imagine that if you were a nomadic tribe, how easy it would be to get around on this steppe. If you had a bunch of horses that you could constantly resupply with grass and bring them from place to place, how if you wanted to start in Mongolia, for example, and just start traveling west, it would be pretty easy to spread down this way or go into Hungary. And that's kind of how we see a lot of these same groups bringing their influences into different places around this time period. So naturally, that brings us to the Mongols. So in the 13th century, we had the giant expansion of the Mongol Empire after they were a bunch of different separate tribes who were consolidated under Genghis Khan and started a massive expansion campaign that went all through China and all the way into Hungary and Poland. They actually simultaneously defeated the armies of Hungary and Poland, which came as a massive shock to the people in Europe at the time, and they were probably doubly shocked when the Mongols abruptly turned around and left because the Khans died. So you can imagine the kind of psychological effect that would have of how effective the Mongols were in the style of warfare that they practiced. And as you can see, the swords really haven't changed all that much since the Avars and the Magyars we talked about. Even though we're getting to be like 800 years later right now, we're still looking at very, very similar swords, which is this thin blade, lightly curved, small guard, canted grip. And you can see how the Mongols were using them in this painting here. Oh, and something else I wanted to point out. Mongols are often thought of as horse archers martially, and while they were definitely excellent horse archers, they also employed a lot of melee weapons and a lot of shock cavalry too. The Mongols did have a lot of heavy cavalry units that operated more similar to the stereotypical European knight. That is to say, they wore armor, their horses sometimes wore armor too, and they fought with lances, sabers, and maces. So even though the Mongols made a lot of use out of bows from horseback, they also got into a lot of melee scraps too. A lot of times it was a matter of using the lighter cavalry to string out the enemy, and then using the heavy cavalry to actually smash and rout the opponent. So there was definitely a time that the saber would come into play. Although I think in both cases, it's the case with a lot of swords, where the saber is predominantly the backup weapon. If you were a Mongolian light cavalry unit, your primary weapon would be your bow. But if you were a Mongolian heavy cavalry unit, your primary weapon would be the lance. And then the sword is more the thing that you drew when you got into a melee scrap, because your horse was no longer quite as mobile and giving you those advantages of the lance and of the bow. So next we get into Ottoman sabers. What I want to draw your attention to on this slide is the time period. I put a lot of time period on this slide because, quite frankly, I could give an entire lecture about Ottoman sabers because they have a lot of different kinds and a lot of very different interesting kinds. But for the sake of brevity, I decided to only go with one slide for the Ottomans, and we're going to talk about a few things at once here. On the far left here, we have a early Ottoman killich. Killich is just the Ottoman word for saber. If you wanted to refer to a Turkish saber, you could say a killich or you could say a Turkish saber. It means the exact same thing. This particular example, you're already going to see some greater differences than the other sabers we've looked at so far. The other sabers we've looked at so far have been pretty similar, but now we're starting to see some differences. You can see that same canting of the grip. However, now the pommel is basically gone. Instead, we have a pommel cap, which is just this little piece of metal mounted at the end, but we don't have a developed pommel anymore. The crossguard is also getting a little bit longer, and it's a little hard to see here, but on these early killiches, you don't typically have a yeoman, but we do have this back edge. If you can just see where the metal changes color a little bit there, that isn't raised on the back edge, but it is sharpened on the back edge. So there were still false edges on the early Ottoman killiches. Now on the right here, we have later Ottoman killiches. And by later, I'm talking about 18th century for both of these ish. You started getting sabers of this time period, of this style though, from the 17th century to the 19th century. This top one is a killich, and it is a little bit different than the earlier one that you can see on the left here. For starters, we have a more prominent yeoman. It's basically a sharpened back edge again, but this one is broader at the tip. It actually steps up. You can see the fullering here on the blade too. And you can also see how the grip has changed, how we've gone from having no pommel but a pommel cap to instead being built almost a little bit like a messer, where we have two pieces of wood that are getting pinned onto the grip at either side, and you can see one of those pins there. And we also have this sort of bulbous pommel. At the bottom here, we have what is called a pala, P-A-L-A. This is going to be shorter and broader from a killich, and I know if you haven't seen a pala before, they look kind of ridiculous, and they look kind of cumbersome, but let me tell you, they are extremely nimble and lightweight swords. The way these were constructed was very, very interesting. If you see the section on the spine here, this is what's called a T-shaped cross-section. In Western Europe, they sometimes call these pipe-back blades, but it's basically the same thing, where if you can imagine, if you were to cut the sword right down the middle there and then look at the cross-section, at the spine, you would see like the top of a T shape, and then the blade would be the lower part of the T, because the way they constructed these was they made the spine much broader than the rest of the blade, and then the blade itself would be very, very thin. So even though the blade was broad and curved, it was still very lightweight and thin. And this allowed them to make incredibly effective cutting blades with the pala, where they were thinner, which can help with cutting, curved, which can help with cutting, and they were very, very light because you have such little meat in the blade itself besides that broad spine to support it. And as you can see, we get an absolutely massive yeoman in the last portion of this blade here, where the T-shape ends there. You can see where the spine is ending there, and then where the sharpened back edge is beginning. Also, I want to note the type of curvature we're seeing here is very different than the other sabers we've looked so far. Rather than having a somewhat consistent amount of curve throughout the blade, the first half of the pala up until here is 100% straight, and then it curves dramatically in the second half. This was basically two different pieces of straight metal that were fused together crooked. So even though you sometimes get swords that look like they have similar amount of curves, depending on where the curve starts can actually indicate different things about the saber and how it would feel in the hand or how it would perform in the cut. So
Wait, I
now,
have a quick question.
yeah, go for it.
Do we know how they were getting the slight curves we were seeing then? Is that something they were hammering out, or?
To specify real quick, when I was talking about how the pala was made, I was talking about two pieces of metal being fused together in the middle. I was saying it looks that way. I don't think that's how they were actually made. I think they were made more like normal swords. But as far as the actual forging of sabers go, I am definitely not an expert in blacksmithing, but as far as I know, I don't think you have to go through any special procedures to make a sword curve versus just making it straight. I think it's just the shape at which you hammer out the blade. I don't know if there's actually any special procedure to make a blade more or less curved. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. How about anybody else, since I'm doing questions? Anybody else have anything on what I've talked about so far? All right, cool. So now we're coming back to Eastern Europe, although now we're in the Renaissance, and we are starting to see some more dramatic changes with the sabers there too. Remember, all the way back with the Avars, we had those sort of proto-Turkic Mongolic sabers there with the light curve and the thin blade and the small guards, but none of these really look like that anymore. They've done a lot of changing since then. For starters, both types of sabers we're seeing here, and by the way, the top one here with the crossguard is Hungarian, and the lower one we see here with the knuckle bow is Polish. So they're both broader than what we've looked at before. And in the case of the Hungarian one, we see that massive yeoman, not unlike the pala or the killich that we looked at in the last slide. We also see that crossguard getting substantially longer. So while I commented with the nomadic step sabers early on, how they had that very small crossguard that likely really didn't provide much, if any, hand protection, this Hungarian one, by contrast, has a pretty sizable crossguard for its proportions, which I think could definitely provide some hand protection. You also see those langets there. You don't see these on a lot of Western European swords, so in case anybody doesn't know, really the only point of langets is to provide a mounting point on your scabbard. Basically, your scabbard would have grooves cut into it, so when you sheathed the sword, the langet would go into those grooves and prevent the sword from rattling around as much. They also provided a neat anchor point on the grip there, how you can see the langets go the other way into the grip, and that just provides more points of contact on the grip to make the whole sword a little bit more robust and less likely to loosen up over time. In the bottom left here, we can see a Hungarian, I'm going to say Hussar, he may or may not be a Hussar, but we're going to see a Hungarian person of the time period with one of these sabers. And if you notice, he's dressed very, very similar to the Turkish cavalry we saw in the last slide. Can I actually go back? Yeah. So this is either a Turkey Deli, Akinji, or Sipahi. I'm not 100% sure which. I'm going to speculate he's a Deli. I don't think he's a Sipahi, but in any case, if you look at how this Turkish cavalryman is dressed from around the 15th, 16th century, and then compare that to the Hungarian cavalryman here, a lot of similarities in the style of dress going on, and none of this was by accident. If you look at what is definitely an example of an Eastern European Hussar here, they were clearly emulating the style of the Turkish cavalry at the time, which makes sense because not only were these places bordering a lot of the time, they also had a lot of trade going on, a lot of war going on. The Ottoman cavalry was something that had a clear development on the course of European cavalry development, especially in Eastern Europe. Although I want to point out that it sometimes gets oversimplified into the narrative that the Ottomans introduced the saber to Europe, which, as we've already seen in previous slides, isn't true, because we were seeing a Hungarian cavalryman here using a saber, but Hungary was also founded by the Magyars like 500 years earlier, and they were also using sabers then. So the saber wasn't anything particularly new in these regions, although I think it is very safe to say that it was influenced by Ottoman and Turkish sabers. Finally, we have this Polish saber here. We're seeing even more development of hand protection. We're seeing this knuckle bow getting added on to protect the front of the hand. And you can also see this thumb ring here. Now, the thumb ring was oftentimes not to provide protection for the thumb itself. The thumb would be placed through there and would give an extra point of contact on your grip of the sword to make it easier to rotate in your hand for certain techniques we're going to look at later. And while it could potentially provide some incidental hand protection, it's really not its chief purpose. I think your thumb is still pretty vulnerable in the thumb ring for the most part. Okay, so if we move on to Central Europe now, we're also seeing sabers starting to leak a little bit further west in Europe around the same time period. This is still in the Renaissance. So first of all, in the top left, we have examples of German Dusaks, or Dussaks. I've heard it said both ways. I really have no idea, to be completely honest. As you can see, these blades are very quite a bit in terms of how much curve they have. Some of them are slightly curved, some of them are pretty decently curved, others are dead straight. These basket hilts were very common at the time in Germany for a lot of different swords. Sometimes they get called broadswords in the case of the bottom one there when they're dead straight. And it seems to me the only thing that really differentiates a Dusak a lot of the time is that it's one of these hilts with a curved blade on it. Now, what's interesting about the Dusak in this time period is that it's shorter than the sabers we've looked at up until now. Most of the sabers we've looked up until now, whether they were the Mongols, the Ottomans, and the Eastern Europeans, we're looking at swords that in total, including the hilt, were about 38 inches long on average. Now, you're going to see a little bit of variety in there. Some, I'm sure, got upwards of 40 inches a little bit. Some might have been as short as 36 inches, but they're swords meant for use on horseback, so they need to have that reach. But the Dusak, on the other hand, averages 36 inches, which is a bit shorter. Now, you could find examples of these that were longer cavalry swords, clearly, but they are definitely outside of the norm. And you could find Dusaks as short as sometimes, I think there were, there's a few finds at like 28 inches in total length and 32 inches in total length, which you could not really use effectively from horse at all. There's no way you'd be able to like reliably hit somebody who was on foot if you had that length of saber. So these were largely infantry swords, and we're also starting to get some of our first true sources on how they were used. We have multiple treatises from the Renaissance explicitly explaining how to use a Dusak. This one is from Husler on the right here. He only has a couple plates showing sabers, but he's one of the only people who actually shows a developed steel Dusak, so I wanted to show that. Other people often show training tools in their plates. Now, at the bottom here, we have a Italian sword called a storta. Now, the storta is, I'm going to consider it a saber, although you could argue that it is also a falchion, and I wouldn't really disagree with you. Basically, what the Italian storta is it's a late falchion with a developed hilt, and you tend to see them with a little bit of curvature to them. But they're proportioned pretty similar to a falchion, normally under 3 feet in length, right around there. You start to see these extra bars on there as well, different ways to grip it while protecting your hand. And you start to see not only thinner blades, a lot of early falchions got very, very broad towards the point, and these tend to have relatively narrower blades by comparison to earlier falchions throughout. And you also start to get that light degree of curvature. So I think you could argue that these came from falchions rather than outside saber influences, and I wouldn't necessarily agree with you, but I still think it's interesting to note how sabers are developing in multiple places in Europe at the same time. Oh, you could also make the case for the German Dusak, the same thing, actually. I think you could argue that Messer fencing and falchion fencing had the clearest influence on Dusak fencing, although I will also say to that, there are some very clear references in Dusak treatises to Eastern European influences. There is one of Meyer's plates in Meyer's 16th century Dusak treatise. He has a plate that is very clearly depicting a Polish fencer. They're wearing a very typical Polish style of dress. And then in a very obscure Dusak treatise called Schiomatica et Haplomachia, it's Latin, I'm almost surely mispronouncing it. There is also some plates of Turkish and Hungarian saber fencers, and the author references the Dusak as being inspired by Eastern weapons. So I actually have that plate later on, so we'll talk about that more then. So next we're going to get into Indian, Mughal, and Afghan sabers from the 16th to 19th century. So the Mughals, I know Mughal history might be a little obscure for some people. They're basically Persianized Mongols. They're Mongols who settled in the Middle East and over time took on more and more Persian influences. But Mughal was the Persian word for Mongol. So once again, even now we're seeing that steppe nomad influence in the development of sabers still. But in the 16th century, the Mughals took over the Indian subcontinent, and they actually held it all the way until the 19th century when British colonialism got going. And all the way back in the 16th century, we see this type of hilt on tulwars. Now, as far as I'm aware, the blade is pretty irrelevant to categorizing a tulwar. Tulwars come with a broad variety of blades. Some of them are shamshir in style. Some of them are, very curved, moderately curved, yeoman, no yeoman. Some of them were just straight up European saber blades that were hilted on tulwar hilts. But the main feature of the tulwar is what is sometimes called a Delhi hilt here. And this hilt is very, very interesting and very different from all the other saber hilts we've looked at up until this point. But basically what you're going to see is a very small crossguard, a bulge in the middle of the guard, how it gets really broad there in the middle of the grip. And then we're going to see this flat disc at the bottom of the grip. And I want you to try to imagine holding a tulwar for a minute. It's very small, by the way. You have to cram your hand in there. Some people say that was because Indian people were smaller. That's not true. Indian people were not even if you could argue the average Indian person was a couple inches shorter than the average European person, the tulwar hilts are completely inconsistent with hand size differences. So just want to throw that out there. But anyway, you would kind of have to wedge your hand in between the disc and the crossguard in order to get on that more bulbous part of the grip and have it fill up your hand. And what this would actually prevent you from doing is pointing the tip too much. So if you tried to point the tip of the sword forward so it would be in line with your arm, the disc would actually dig into your wrist and discourage you from doing that. So we're seeing a saber here that is designed with a very intentional purpose. It's basically not even encouraging you to hold it in a certain way. The tulwar is demanding that its user hold it in a very specific way. And we're going to look at more at why that is later on. You can see an example of a guy on foot holding a Delhi-style tulwar here with a shield in the other hand. And then the pulwar here is usually more attributed to Afghanistan, although you can find examples of tulwars in Afghanistan and pulwars in India. And the blades are completely interchangeable. Once again, the blade really isn't a defining feature of the pulwar. You can find a broad variety of blades on them. But the difference with the pulwar is it's basically a less restrictive version of the tulwar hilt. You're seeing a upswept crossguard here, meaning you can adjust your hand a little bit more in the top of the grip there. But then we're also seeing a ball pommel at the bottom. So you don't have this disc necessarily digging into the bottom of your wrist if you try to point the sword forward. You could handle and grip this sword much more in the style of a lot of European sabers. Also, this little metal tulip shape on the top of the guard is present in, I think, every single pulwar I've ever seen. So that isn't just this isn't a particularly decorative pulwar. They just all kind of look like this. All right, before I get into the next part, because we're going to start getting into the modern era a little bit more and out of what I like to call classical saber fencing, does anybody have any questions about the history or design of any of the classic sabers we talked about? All still with me?
Mm-hmm.
All right, cool. All right, so now once we get into the 18th and 19th century, we're going to start seeing some changes in not only the sabers, but the context under which the sabers were used and kind of manufactured. So the big difference is that in the 18th century, we had industrialization get going. And prior to industrialization, sabers weren't necessarily made in mass scales. Maybe you have a few blacksmiths who collaborate to very efficiently forge sabers. But once we get to industrialization, where we start getting large scale factories and machines that can really start letting products be just churned out in masses, we start getting standardization amongst military sabers. So the way that works is we had the sword typically referred to by its year and its unit designation. So for example, at the top here, we have a British 1796 light cavalry saber. And most sabers in Europe at the time period use the same naming scheme. So it's very useful nowadays if you ever want to like look up a certain saber, you can basically just pick the year they started making the saber and the unit that it belonged to and get results for the exact same sword. So the 1796 light cavalry saber is one that's definitely influenced by Eastern European saber usage, and it's not just in its design. Up until British had one similar sword in I think 1788 was their last saber pattern. But anyway, up until the 1796 light cavalry saber became very popular, you saw more straight swords in Britain, more spadroons, more broadswords, basket hilt type things. But then the 1796 saber was very, very well received in Britain, and it was also very fashionable at the time. And the person who actually worked on the design of the sword and helped implement its uses was a guy named John Gaspard Le Marchant. I can't say names, but anyway, Gaspard was a British cavalryman who actually trained with Austrians who had in turn copied Hungarian style of hussar usage. So we're seeing a kind of transfer of saber ideas from Eastern Europe bleeding into Western Europe and them getting very popular with the design of the saber there and also its implementation. Below the 1796 cavalry saber, we have a French 1800 cavalry sword here. And what we're going to see here is a very classic shape of saber guard with 3 brass bars on it. This gets you more hand protection than the simple knuckle bow. It was also very, very easy to make with industrial machinery at the time. If you had to think about like a Dusac hilt, by contrast, those are pretty elaborate, and there's a lot that goes into making them. And if you are a government and you want to order 40,000 of these, do you really want to pay the cost associated with making all of those elaborate hilts? Probably not. So you can just kind of go with the 3-bar and get most of the same protection. Also, an added bonus of the 3-bar hilt was that it was very comfortable to wear. Since the 3 bars are on the outside of the hand, when you actually sheath it, there is no bars in the portion of the sword that face the inside of your hip or thigh, so it's actually not going to dig into you. Then at the bottom here, we have a British 1824 officer saber. Now, this is when we really start seeing the type of sabers emerge that are taught in most military saber manuals. These are still sabers, they're still curved, but we start seeing some pretty drastic changes happening with the saber's design. We're seeing the blade get thinner, we're seeing the grip get longer, and we're seeing more elaborate hand protection. So this came from a few places. I'm going to get more into why this change happened later on and some of its effects, but this is almost a blending of the saber that was kind of a import weapon to a lot of places in Europe at the time with weapons that had already pre-existed there, like the spadroon, the small sword, and even the Scottish basket hilt. Seeing a question from Scott real quick. Yes, so that is correct, Scott. The langets here actually slotted over the scabbard. These metal scabbards did not have notches in them the way some of the earlier leather and wood ones did. Instead, they would just kind of clamp over the outside. Honestly, you could probably make a pretty good argument that they weren't as necessary on this one. It might have just been them emulating the style of some of the more Eastern European ones they had. But in general, I think metal scabbards tend to be a bit more snug than wooden leather ones. I've had a few antique sabers without langets, and the metal scabbards hold them pretty tight just fine, especially if they had a ricasso. So, yeah, I don't really know why they kept langets exactly. Maybe they just thought they looked cool.
I mean, they might, but it's kind of cool too. In that top picture, especially, you can see the indentations of where the langets would sit, and then you can almost see like a wearing.
Yeah, I was
second one.
I actually didn't even notice that when I was picking these pictures out, but yeah, that I definitely think you're right there. yeah, and then you see the langets go away completely on the bottom saber. Even though the scabbard it's using is mostly still leather, there's no langets to speak of there. Oh, also, before I move on from this slide, the hussar you see on the right there. So hussar started getting used in more Western European countries, like Britain, France, all started using the same hussars that had been a mainstay in Eastern European armies for a while, although the word hussar kind of took on a little bit of a different meaning over time. If you asked me what a hussar is, I'd kind of have to write you at least a paragraph to explain it, because originally hussar could include very heavily armored shock units. Like Polish winged hussars would be wearing quite a bit of plate armor and using a lance, which is like classic. That's basically a knight at the end of the day. It's very similar. But then when you look at this hussar here, he's wearing no armor whatsoever, and he's armed with only a saber, which is definitely more characteristic of light cavalry. So even though the same kind of, some of the same philosophies around horse warfare were brought over, what exactly hussar was very subject to change over time. But what you can see very consistently over time is the manner of dress. We're seeing the animal pelts here, we're seeing the big boots, we're seeing the big hat, we're seeing the very fancy jackets going on. So if you can't see the Eastern European influence and the Turkish influence in the weapon design necessarily, you can absolutely see it in the uniforms that were being used at the time. Seeing another question here. How do I classify them? So I would classify them, first of all, if they were straight. If they're straight, they're not sabers. That's the first rule we got to get out of the way. If we're talking about straight swords, we're not talking about sabers. After we've established that they're not sabers, it's going to depend on whether or not they were meant for cavalry or for infantry. If they were meant for infantry, what we're likely dealing with is a spadroon, which is basically a straight, either single-edged or double-edged sword with a very narrow blade with no profile taper, and it was used in a cut or thrust manner with varying complexity of hilts. If it is a larger sword, that was definitely meant for cavalry, and when I say larger, normally a spadroon is going to tap out at absolute most like 40 inches total. But if we're dealing with a cavalry sword, they can get much larger for that, especially if they're a straight sword built for heavy cavalry uses. There was some French cuirassier swords that were completely straight, and the French cuirassier swords are a little bit unique. I would either call the French cuirassier swords estocs or palashes, depending if they were meant either for cutting or thrusting. The estoc ones were completely unedged, and they used only the point. They were very, very stiff, very, very heavy swords too. The palash, by contrast, is normally a bit shorter. It's just kind of like a straight, broad, saber-ish proportioned sword, and that would be more for cutting. And yes, Scott is absolutely right. The French definitely like using the word épée a lot, and you see them apply épée to a lot of different swords. I actually try to avoid French naming conventions for swords around this time period because they do it a little different than everybody else. And one very annoying thing, at least to me, that some of the French do in later time periods is they call everything a saber even if it isn't curved, which drives me nuts because nobody else does that except the French. So if you ever want to counter anything I'm saying with, oh, a saber can be straight, just bring up the fact that the French called straight sword sabers, and you'll beat me. I've got nothing against that. They definitely did. All right, so all right, so you knew what we were getting into. All right, so now we're moving on to North African and Persian sabers, and the reason I put these a little later is because they had a very interesting influence on Napoleonic sabers. I wanted to have a point of bringing up, but anyway, before we get into that. So when we're talking about North African and Persian sabers, one of the most common kinds we're going to find is the shamshir, which is the top left sword here. Now, while at a glance, the shamshir might look kind of similar to like a Ottoman kilich, they have pretty similar grips, for example, we're actually dealing with a pretty different sword here in a lot of ways. Probably the first thing to point out is the blade is completely unfulled. Almost every saber we've looked at up until this point has had some type of fullering going on, whether it's just one big fuller or multiple small ones. This blade is completely flat. There are never any fullers on any shamshear I've ever seen. Those tend to be more killich blades. And then we see this point getting very, very narrow very quickly. We don't have this type of killich shape in the last third of the blade where the blade bulges into a yeoman and then comes to a point. We just kind of have this very slender arc that eventually reaches a point without ever doing the whole yeoman thing. So shamshear blades are actually pretty different than a lot of the killich blades we've been looking at, even though the swords kind of look similar at a first glance. Why is that? It's kind of hard to say. They definitely seem to have less priority put on the false edge. Some of the shamshears don't even have a false edge. They definitely seem to be prioritizing the front edge of the sword, and there are some techniques the shamshear definitely helps with that we're going to talk about in our technique section. And if you look at the shamshear blade, they always have the same type of curvature where they're very, very straight at first, and then they curve rapidly in the second half of the sword. So even though the sword is radically curved overall, it's one of the most curved type of sabers you can find. It's always in the last half or so of the blade that curve really takes place. Below that, we have a Moroccan nimcha. Nimcha is another one that is going to be mostly characterized by this style of grip and guard. This knuckle bow with the 3 upswept quillons is very common for the nimcha. Also, you always see that knuckle bow set very, very close to the grip with that little divot that I assume the pinky goes into. I've never seen anyone talk about nimchas, though. I'm interested in them because I think they're cool swords, but it's one of those sabers it's like you can find stuff about, but very rarely do you find anybody who is like an expert on nimchas, if there even are any. But the blades on nimchas vary a lot. Some of them were Turkish blades mounted on nimcha hilts. Other times you can find European blades that were imported and mounted on this style of hilt. So the nimcha is defined, while they're almost always sabers, they are mostly defined by that type of hilt you see there. But in the Napoleonic era, you have the Egypt campaign where Napoleon invaded Egypt and Syria, and after the Egyptian campaign, what becomes very, very stylish for the next few years of the Napoleonic War is shamshear blades mounted on European hilts. You can see a very nicely preserved example of that here, of what is absolutely a shamshear style blade mounted on a European saber hilt. This didn't stick around for very long. This was only a thing for like a few years in the Napoleonic War, where this was like the cool, fashionable thing for an officer to have a shamshear blade, and then it went away really quick and never came back. I think for good reason. Not that the shamshear is bad. I actually think the shamshear is a great sword, but the reason I don't think it made sense was you don't see saber treatises of nations that are doing this really updated to reflect the change in weaponry. So it looked like they just started using radically different weapons than what they were really supposed to be using without really changing their fighting style at all. So I can imagine that in a lot of cases, the way the officer was handling the shamshear wasn't really the way the shamshear was intended to be handled by people who liked the shamshear's design. Also, a lot of these blades were made in Europe. Some of them were trophies that were taken back from Egypt and Syria and then mounted. Other times, if someone maybe didn't get one of these trophies from war, they would commission one of like a European smith to make a shamshear blade in this style. And these are often called Mameluke style swords in modern sword collecting terminology. The final picture we have on the right here is actually a Mameluke who served in Napoleon's army. He had a division that were called Mameluke de la Garde, I think they were called. And this is actually a real photograph of one of those people. There was kind of a cool project where photography came to be a thing before everybody who had participated in the Napoleonic Wars had died, and somebody put together a project where they got people who were soldiers during the Napoleonic War to put on their old uniforms and pose with their old weapons and stuff and have their photograph taken. This one has also been color corrected. The pictures themselves are in black and white, but I just thought it was cool that unlike all the other previous stuff that we've looked at where we've had paintings of everything, we actually have a photograph of Egyptian Mameluke here. So pretty neat. All right, last one for the history slide. So we're going to get into techniques after this, but as far as history goes, the history of military sabers taps out in the 20th century. The top one there is a infantry saber, and what happened with infantry sabers was they basically just kept getting narrower and narrower as they saw less and less use, to the point where they weren't really great fighting swords anymore. That saber there, could you sharpen it up and stab and cut somebody with it? Sure. Do you really want to? Not really. A lot of 19th century infantry swords were really just part of the dress uniform. Maybe you could do some dueling with them, but by this point in time, guns had progressed to the point that they were so good that having a saber you were actually planning on using, is that a lifeguard's lion saber up top? I don't think so. Ivory hilt typically means naval, not cavalry. So yeah, we really don't see a lot of infantry sword usage anymore in this time period. What we do see with the cavalry is at the bottom there is the cavalry stop using the saber. The bottom sword there is a British, I think it's a 1908 cavalry sword, and during World War I, the British cavalry did carry these. These are not sabers. These have a giant bull guard and a completely straight blade without an edge, and then a very, very acute needle-like point. It does look like a sport fencing sword. The only difference is, while a sport fencing sword is very, very light, this sword, even though it looks very narrow, is extremely heavy for its size. These swords were, I think, like 3.5 pounds, and what they were was they were hardly even swords. They were mobile lances. They were a lance that you could put in a scabbard, and when you needed a weapon from horseback, you could charge at somebody with this and skewer them. And that was really all it was for. You used it in basically the exact same manner as a lance. You just, impaled people from a moving horse. But to actually come to a stop with this weapon and try to fence with it would just be a complete nightmare. You wouldn't be able to cut, and it's too heavy to fence with quickly in the point, like a rapier or a small sword would. You could probably break somebody's nose if you wanted to just hit them with the blade, though. It's rigid as hell. On the right here, we have the last military saber that was really put into use. This is a Polish 1934 light cavalry saber. This is really an oddity, because 1934, we're getting into, like, these were used in World War II. Not for very long, but these swords were used by Polish light cavalry in World War II, and ostensibly they haven't really changed since the Polish sabers we looked at back in the 1600s. They look very similar in terms of proportion, curvature, fullering, hand protection. The grip is constructed a bit like a messer now, where the wood is pinned on, but for the most part, the saber is pretty much the same. There are some misleading stories about how these were used in World War II. Some of you might have heard people talking about, like, Polish cavalry charging German tanks. It's complete fabrication. If anything, it might stem from Nazi propaganda. Basically, the reason Polish had cavalry at this time was to off-road. They used them to do reconnaissance, first of all, because you could send them places you couldn't send a car, because the wheels would get bogged down in different types of terrain. So you could send a detachment of cavalry to go scouting through a forest very easily, for example. The other thing they were used for is moving around artillery placements. So if you had a big artillery gun that you had to drag through the mud, and you didn't have a good vehicle for transporting that artillery gun through the mud, you could hook it up to a team of horses, and they could do it for you. So even though the Polish cavalry at this time had sabers, it's pretty questionable how much use these sabers actually saw in warfare. It more just seems like well, if we're having cavalry, what's the harm in them carrying a saber type deal? But that is going to be our last slide for our history and sword design section. And after this, we're going to start talking about how some of these weapons were actually used. And I know we're already an hour in. I have more stuff, so I'm just going to keep going. But if anybody feels like they signed up for an hour and they can't stay anymore, you're not going to hurt my feelings if you dip. Just a heads up, if you can't stick around, not going to hurt my feelings, because I'm going over time. But does anybody have any questions about any of the history or the saber design stuff we've talked about? All right, cool. Let's talk about how these things were actually fought with then. All right, so starting off, I don't know how many of you have handled a saber before. I know a saber isn't one of our bigger weapons at CKDF, so my apologies if some of this is kind of rudimentary to some people, but the saber feels pretty unique in the hand compared to a lot of other swords. This is mostly because the saber is a pretty substantial blade in proportion to the hilt. We're talking about swords that can get fairly broad, even though a lot of them are also pretty narrow. Curved, which can add weight because you're basically taking a longer sword and then bending it into a shorter sword. So that's a lot of blade, especially with the really curved ones. And then the hilts on sabers are often pretty light. You tend to not get grips like long swords that are very, very long and heavy, or like rapiers that are extremely complex and have a lot of different bars and stuff. So the saber is kind of a very blade favored weapon, and you can really feel that in the handling of the saber. The saber balances further forward from the guard than most other swords. So if you were to place a saber on your finger, most sabers tend to balance around 7 inches or so, which would be very, very bad if you put that same weighting on arming sword, on like a long sword or something that wants to be more nimble in the tip. Lots of other swords tend to balance around, especially cut and thrust swords, like 4 inches, I think, is pretty average on a lot of swords, but the saber is very, very forward weighted by comparison. But all of this is at the same time that the sword is not particularly heavy. The base weight for a lot of swords, because of the deep fullers that are putting into them, most sabers are 2 pounds-ish in weight. Even the cavalry examples. A lot of cavalry swords are only about 2 pounds in weight, even if they're 38 inches long and fairly broad. So what this leaves you with is it's a sword that kind of wants to go forward all the time because it's very light, but you have all of the mass in front of your hand. So if you hold a saber, the effect that you have is a sword that wants to drop forward and down all the time. It doesn't want to like bounce around at the tip, and it doesn't want to change directions very quickly. It wants to build momentum and then maintain momentum. And a lot of saber fencing is very reflective of that, as we're going to see. So the first technique we're going to talk about is the draw cut. And these first few techniques we're going to talk about are present in all saber fencing to some degree. We're going to get into some more like specific stuff later on, but this is kind of like universal saber fencing stuff here. So on the left, I have a little diagram kind of showing the difference between what a draw cut and a chop cut are like. So a chop cut is what a lot of you probably practice on pels and try to get really, really good at drilling, which is you cast the sword out until your arm is straight, then you deliver a blow and then lift the sword back up. Now these type of cuts can be very effective. They hew deeply into the target, and they can inflict very bad wounds. They can sever things off of a target. Chop cuts are perfectly effective, but the way a curved sword can also get mileage out of a cut is doing a drawing cut. Now you can do this on a straight sword too, but the saber favors it for a lot of reasons. And basically what a draw cut is instead of trying to chop through a target by casting your sword out, you instead maintain a right angle, or approximately a right angle, between the blade and your arm. And then you connect your cut in about the middle of your blade where the curvature of the sword starts, and then run the edge across the target. I did not. One of my friends who is an artist actually did these for me because she is very kind and very helpful. If you ever need a artist for anything, let me know. I always want to like send, commissions and stuff her way because she's awesome. Oh, she also drew my little portrait here that you can see beside my name when I'm talking. She also drew that. So anyway, the draw cut, yes. But anyway, so what the draw cut does, even though it is less likely to kind of hack and hew into a target, it causes really bad lacerations because you have this curved edge being placed against the target and then run across it. And the result is kind of opening up a lot of the target's veins and causing them to bleed very badly. I'm sorry if that's kind of graphic, but that's the reason it's effective. And if you ever wanted to see this principle in action, what you can do is the next time you're cutting meat, the next time you have a steak or a chicken breast or something like that, go ahead and take a knife and try to just do a chop cut straight through it. Just bring down the edge in like a straight blow against it and see what kind of damage it does. And then compare that to placing the edge of a kitchen knife, preferably a curved one, against the piece of meat, and then pulling that edge across, just dragging it across. And what you'll see is that draw cut leaves a pretty, surprisingly, even though it didn't have the same momentum or the same impact behind it, it can leave a really nasty cut in the target. And this was practiced on a lot of particularly curved sabers on Middle Eastern examples. So like I mentioned with the Talwar hilt before, we're coming back to it. Remember when I said you couldn't point the Talwar forward because of that disc in the hilt? Well, this is why. Because if you hold a Talwar, you're going to maintain approximately a 90-degree angle between your arm and the blade, and that is going to allow you to basically do those draw cuts on command, because you don't have to adjust technique at all in order to get that drawing effect every time you throw a cut. The sword is doing that for you by telling you to hold it in a certain way. And in this top example here, you can see a British fencer and an Indian fencer. And look at the manner in which both of them is holding the sword. The British swordsman is presenting the point forward, and he's holding the blade more or less in line with his arm, whereas the Indian fencer is raising up that Talwar, and you can see that 90-degree angle he's maintaining between the blade and his arm. So if he were to strike at the British fencer here, he would be doing that dragging action with the blade. And there was a French Hussar who served during the Napoleon's Egyptian campaigns, who basically summed this up better than I ever could on why the draw cut works and why it's effective. And he wrote, "Every cutting edge is a saw, more or less fine, which produces its effect only by moving horizontally on the object it is used against. To produce this effect at the moment you strike, draw back the hand to the rear. Therein lies the terrible secret of the cuts of the Mamelukes." And remember, the Mamelukes were the ones who were using the shamshears, which is the style of blade you see here, which are those dramatically curved blades. So I think it's pretty safe to say that the more curved your sword is, the more intended it is for the draw cut, even if it could chop and even if straight swords can draw. These really curved swords are really particularly good at draw cutting. And that's part of the reason I also speculated earlier that they didn't catch on in Europe when they were brought back from Egypt, because they were probably using them more in a manner of the chopping cut, like their treatises at the time were advising. And if you're not using a shamshear with the drawing cut, it kind of defeats the purpose of the sword. Okay, so next we're going to move on to the moulinet. Now, the moulinet is a technique that really takes into effect the handling dynamics of the sabers I spent a little bit of time talking about, which is the forward momentum while still having the light weight. Basically, what a moulinet is it is a method of building or maintaining momentum for the saber cut. This can be done in a variety of ways. All of them are basically articulating a certain point at the arm. Basically, either revolving the saber around the wrist, revolving the saber around the elbow, or revolving the saber from the shoulder. You can see a few different examples of this, of the plate on the right, which is from a French manual written by a Polish guy. It is a very, very obscure manual, but also a really interesting one. And it shows some of the most complicated moulinet patterns I've ever seen. And you can see what he's basically showing in these treatises is different ways you can cut with the sword and then roll it in its path to keep it going into a new cut, because that is what you're trying to do with saber fencing a lot of times. Rather than raising the sword up, bringing it down in a cut, stopping it, raising it up again, bringing it down in another cut, you throw a cut forward, and then you revolve a part of your arm to roll the cut from the saber into another cut. It allows you to not only cut very quickly, but also do so while maintaining a lot of force and momentum, even though the saber is a very light sword. Even though it's light, it can actually just build up a lot of speed while you're doing these moulinets so that it still hits with a lot of force. So the next thing I want to talk about is cavalry applications. Sabers often get stereotyped as cavalry-only swords, and while we've seen in our history slides that that isn't exactly true, there is definitely a heavy correlation between sabers and cavalry. Some of the reasons why that is the horse does a lot of the work for you that the last two techniques we talked about kind of simulate. The first thing is a drawing motion. So if you have a saber on horseback and you just hold out the edge, you don't even swing it, but just hold out the edge at a passing target, what naturally happens is you get a draw cut because you're placing the edge of a weapon against the target while you're moving past it on your horse. The edge is going to get run along the target, and that can be accentuated if you're using a curved sword. Another benefit of the draw cut over the chop cut from horseback is you have less risk of your sword getting embedded in the target. If you were using a axe, for example, on horseback, a problem that you would run into very, very quickly is even if you hit somebody with an axe from a moving horse, if the axe gets stuck in that target, it's going to be torn free of your hand as the horse moves unless it comes out really easily. But if you're never chopping into the target, if you're just doing these drawing actions as you move past the target, then you basically have no risk or very little risk of losing your weapon by it getting embedded in the target. The other thing that the horse does for you is it helps with the moulineing type actions, because the purpose of the mouliné is to add momentum to a very lightweight weapon, to basically help accelerate it so that it deals more percussive damage when it strikes than if you were to just raise it up and bring it down. But obviously, if you're on a horse that's moving 30 miles an hour, it's basically doing the work of the mouliné for you. The saber is already accelerating. If you just bring it forward, the speed of the horse is going to add to the momentum of the sword. So you're already getting some of the same cutting benefits that the mouliné was going to give you. So next we're going to talk about thrusting. There is a common misconception that curved swords cannot thrust, and I have never seen any evidence of any historical treatise of them even really being too worried about not being able to thrust with a curved sword. The closest you'll see with that is when some European fencers write about Middle Eastern fencers, they will write that they abandon the thrust entirely, but I don't see the same thing from Middle Eastern sources. From some Middle Eastern sources I've read, they talk about thrusts. So I don't know if the Europeans just conceptualized thrust differently and didn't consider what Middle Eastern fencers were doing with the point to not be thrusts. I really don't know. But in everything I've seen, most curved weapons are considered by people who use them to be just fine thrusting swords. Now, what you can do with the curved sword is you can thrust in a slightly different manner than a straight sword. So in the plate on the left here, this is a Polish treatise, and what we're seeing is someone using the curve to slip around an opponent's guard. So if your opponent was standing in a parry and they had just received your cut, you can actually turn your wrist away from their parry and then continue to drive the point, because it's going to arc around the barrier that they've created with the sword. So you can still drive the point even if you don't have a proper angle like you would need with a straight sword. With the plate on the right, this is from Meyer's 1570 Dusak treatise. We can see something similar. If you look at these two fencers here, if you look at red and green kind of in the middle, what is happening here is what's called a Weckerhau, where green was cutting downwards before he was parried by red, and then he flipped his point forward over red's sword and is now attempting to drive his point downward into red's face. So while you could still do this with a straight sword, because the sword is already curving in the direction he wants to throw the point, it just kind of assists the curved sword in doing these thrusts around parries. Now, what I will say is a potential drawback of the curved sword to thrusting is it takes the point offline with your hand. So if you hold your arm straight out in front of you, the point will not be at the same place your hand is pointing. So that can lead to circumstances of inaccuracy. And since sabers also tend to be a little bit more forward weighted, they're a little less nimble in the point than something like a rapier, which bounces around the hilt and is by contrast very, very nimble in the point of the sword. So can you thrust with a curved sword? Yes, just kind of with a few asterisks, and it's better at doing some things than a straight sword and thrust, but it's also a little bit worse in a few other regards. Okay, so now we're going to talk about classic saber techniques. Just to be clear on what I mean by that, I put sabers into two different eras. We have classical saber, which is everything up until industrialization, and then we have military saber or industrial saber, if you prefer, which is all of the saber that came after giant militaries became a thing. Because not only did industrialization standardize the design of sabers within militaries, it also standardized the usage of them to rather than people being trained in saber like a martial art, kind of the way we train HEMA, people were instead learning to use saber at officer school. You would literally attend an academy to become a military officer, and they would teach you how to use your saber out of a book there. It was less a method of learning the art of the weapon to learning a very, very practical and very straightforward system to use the weapon that all of your peers were also learning. So I think it's useful to divide saber techniques into those two groups because they're happening under very, very different contexts. So the first thing I want to look at is cross-cutting. So what cross-cutting is, it's one of the key features of pre-industrial saber fencing, and it's basically the idea that your cuts are both your offense as well as your defense. So if your opponent throws a cut at you, you throw a cut in response, either equal to it or superior to it, to try to counter your opponent's cut and then open them up further. So in this example, we're seeing two right Zornhaus. Blue threw a right Zornhau, red threw a right Zornhau, and they clashed in the middle in what seems to be equal outcome. They both struck with similar amounts of force and at a similar angle. However, there's things each of these fencers could do to try to beat the other opponent by throwing similar cuts. For example, if blue were to throw this right Zornhau and then red came down at a straight vertical angle instead of coming in at a slanted angle, he could potentially suppress blue's cut, push it into the ground rather than just clashing in the middle with him, and leave blue open for a moment where red could deliver another successful cut to blue's body. So cross-cutting typically worked in this manner where you have both fencers throwing cuts in opposition to one another and trying to not only use them to block and deflect the other's cut, but also open them up to successive cuts. So yeah, I really didn't have anything else to say to that, but yeah, that's how cross-cutting works. Now, another technique we see referenced in multiple treatises at this time. Oh, incidentally, earlier I mentioned a treatise called Schematica et Haplomachia, I think it's pronounced, which is this plate on the right here, where we can see the Turkish slice taking place. So the Turkish slice was a very popular technique that was recorded in sources all the way back to the 16th century, and it's still mentioned in treatises up until like the 19th century. And it all seems to stem from a duel that was fought on the left. The left is actually not a plate from a treatise. It is depicting a historical duel that takes place. And I want to go ahead and read an accounting of this duel real quick. Okay, so the duel is recorded like this. The Tartar struck first at his opponent. Skanderbeg struck his attack aside with his left hand, and with his right he cut his throat and neck half through, so that the Tartar fell dead to the floor. Then he severed the neck entirely and took the head and carried it naked and splattered with blood of his enemy to King Arathis. So what we're seeing here is the fencer on the left, who is Skanderbeg, is closing his opponent out with his left arm, suppressing his opponent's arm with his left arm, and then cutting to the back of his head and doing what appears, at least to me, to be a draw cut along his neck afterwards. You can see how he is maintaining that angle between his arm and the blade rather than casting it out, which indicates there's a dragging action going on here and not just a chopping weapon. I also wouldn't be surprised if that was how he was taught to use his saber, since these were Turkish kiliches that were being fought with. Now, the Turkish slice is explained in a few different ways, but it all seems to be about working to the outside of your opponent's arm, that is to say, to be working to your opponent's right if they're right-handed, and then getting on top of their arm, suppressing their arm, and cutting to their head. You can see a slight variation on that on the Schematica plate on the right here, where instead of using his offhand to suppress his opponent's arm, the fencer who's delivering the cut probably first parried a overhead blow from his opponent and then stepped in, dropped his wrist on top of his opponent's wrist, and is now pressing his arm down while also cutting to his head in one tempo. There is a very similar play to that in Myers-Dusak as well. So it seems like the Turkish slice first came from a duel, but then started being a popular thing to include in a lot of different treatises. I also think there might be a reference to it in Lecoucner's Messer, though don't quote me on that. I need to double check that. But there might even be some references to this type of technique before this duel took place. I don't know so much if this duel invented the technique so much as it like popularized it and put it within a lot of people's conscience, because Skanderbeg wasn't just some random guy. He's like this Albanian national hero who won like several battles against vastly outnumbering Ottoman armies. So I think it might just be a situation where he used a technique to win a duel, and then everybody thought Skanderbeg was really cool, so they kept talking about how awesome this technique was. So the last one here, this treatise that I'm pulling this from is a 19th century treatise, but I don't have any plates for this technique. This technique is mentioned in a few textual sources, but we don't actually have any drawings from it from the classical era. So I'm putting a very similar technique in its place, which is Valville's outside volta. But the technique we're actually talking about here is the hellish Polish fourth. And basically the way this technique works is the only thing I would change about this plate to make it look more like the hellish Polish fourth is Valville should have his left leg forward instead of his right leg forward. But basically when your opponent raises their arm to do an overhead blow towards you, you step in towards the direction the blow is falling with a passing step of your left foot, and you do a right Unterhau at the same time their cut falls. The idea of this is you void under their cut while delivering a cut that is going to fall under the arc of theirs. So you strike them at the same time that you dodge them. This sounds very risky, and it kind of is, because you're not putting any opposition from your sword. You're just trusting yourself to dodge under a cut that's falling right towards your head and hitting your opponent in one tempo. But the reason it works so well, because I've messed around with this, and now it's one of my favorite things to do in fencing, it's because you're parking yourself underneath your opponent's sword arm. And it's very difficult for someone to hit you if you're basically standing in their armpit, because they can't just bring their sword down on top of you because you're too close. And if they're holding a sword in only one hand, in order to actually hit you with the blade, they'd have to like bring their wrist into their shoulder and then press the blade down, which is pretty awkward, or try to like flip the point down so it's facing down straight in front of you and stabbing you. So as you can see, it's very awkward for someone to actually hit you if you dive underneath their sword arm. And if you do that in the right tempo, you can do it from a degree of safety. Also, once you're there, you can work from that position. After you struck them with the Unterhau, you could then grapple the arm and close them out, kind of like what you saw in the Turkish slice. So the Polish fourth is a risky technique, but it does have a lot of potential payoff. So next we're going to get into industrial saber techniques. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of later military fencing was influenced by other weapons that were popular in Western and Central Europe at the time that they started using sabers in their military. That is to say, spadroons, broadswords, palashes, and small swords. Small swords particularly for the infantry sabers. So some of the big differences is when we looked at the classical saber stuff, one of the main things we looked at was countercutting. How if your opponent threw a cut at you, your response would be to try to throw an equal or superior cut to either deflect their cut or to open them up further. With small sword style fencing, though, instead, you're dedicating two entirely different tempos to the actions. There is not cuts for defense, there is cuts for offense, and then parries for defense. So what this looks like is I throw a cut, my opponent parries the cut, I recover from my cut. My opponent throws a cut. I parry the cut. They recover from their cut. So it's this separation of actions into very clear double time fencing, rather than doing two actions in opposition to one another. You are defending, offending, defending, offending. And a lot of authors at the time write about how this helps keep you safe, how if you devote an entire tempo in your fencing to the parry, you're much less likely to be hit. The trade-off for this is you also have to now come up with other ways to open up your opponent if they're doing the same thing, because they will also be safer if they're following the same style of fencing. You can also see in this time period how a lot of treatises start teaching smallsword, spadroon, and other weapons at the same time as saber. Very often in treatises from the era, from Western European countries, you will get a treatise that tells you this is how you fight with a sword, and by that I mean any sword, or this is how you fight with a small sword. Now I'm going to teach you some cuts you can also use if you're using a spadroon or a saber. So you see this kind of homogeny in the fighting system where the saber isn't considered like this radically different weapon you have to entirely change your technique to fight with. And instead the infantry saber was just a cut and thrust sword that you want to use in basically the same manner as some of this other stuff, maybe with a few caveats. So the first technique we're going to look at here is the lunge. And the lunge is one of these techniques that is universal amongst weapons that was used at this time period. You'd see the lunge with spadroons, small swords, sabers, the whole 9 yards. And what the lunge allowed you to do was maximize range while also keeping within this double time tempo. So during your attack tempo, you cast the right leg forward, throw all of your weight onto it, and cut out or thrust out with your sword. And as you can see here, these are being done as chop cuts rather than draw cuts, because you're getting the maximum amount of range and you're also generating that forward force from your footwork rather from like a hip rotation or a pull of the shoulder or something. And in a weird way, the lunge kind of allows your thrusts and your cuts to work in the same way, because both are coming from your footwork and throwing a lot of forward force towards your opponent. And if you strike with the edge while doing this, you'll inflict a good cut. But likewise, if you strike with the point while doing this, you'll inflict a good thrust. It really just depends what part of the saber you're connecting with. But besides that, the body mechanics work basically the same, and they work really great within this double time tempo where you get to attack your opponent from super far away and then just collect your body backwards and be ready for their attack. So the next technique we're going to look at is the slip. And in a lot of ways, the slip is the opposite of the lunge, because rather than propelling yourself forward, you're collecting yourself backwards. The lunge, the slip takes place most often when the opponent goes for the leg. So in the left plate you have here, you can see that a French fencer tried to cut the leg of a Scottish fencer. And the Scottish fencer collected his leg backwards and then at the exact same time cut his opponent's leg. Now, why is this so effective? Why is this safe? Well, basically, you have the most reach at the level of your shoulder. If you hold your arm out in front of you, it's going the furthest in front of you when it's held at the level of the shoulder. But if you lower it so it's pointing at the ground, you're actually losing a lot of reach. So this is using your maximum reach against an opponent who was using less than their maximum reach. So the French fencer is like sacrificing reach because he's trying to snipe his opponent's leg, and his opponent can just haul that leg back and pop him in the head at the same tempo. Another really great benefit of the slip is that when your opponent goes for your legs, they necessarily have to lower their head. Because they have to drop their arm down there with the lunge forward, they're dragging their head down lower as well. And if you just slip your leg back and you're rising to your full height while the opponent is sinking down really low in that lunge to go after your legs, it's very easy to get not only a cut against them, but a very effective cut, since they just kind of present their head without any cover to you. There were even some, it totally works for longsword too. Going for legs is just a kind of a risky proposition in general, unless people are using shields. And there was even some treatises at the time who recommended slipping back with every defense you do. So if your opponent lunges at you, slip backwards and parry, just because you're rising into this very tall, very stable posture and gaining a little bit of distance from your opponent to do the parry. And then immediately after the slip, you can go into your lunge and then attack all the way back out at full extension to them. So it's just a way of making sure that you're even safer during your opponent's attack. And for the last one, I wanted to end on a fun technique. This is commonly known as the passata sotto. although in a few English sources they refer to it as the knight thrust. This is most common in smallsword, but you see it show up in saber as well, and it's kind of an extension of saber being influenced by smallsword at the time. But basically the way the passata sotto works is you lunge out as far as you can while leaning over at the waist so low that you actually put a hand on the ground for extra support, and you thrust forward while turning the hilt up to protect your head. So if you see in the top left plate here, they're fencing with sabers, but what's happening is because the right fencer has actually sunk so low that his upturned guard is over his head, now that he's landed this thrust against his opponent, his opponent, if he wants to countercut him, has to countercut at him from above, and the lower fencer has his hilt in opposition, so he can actually parry the saber cut that is likely going to come after his opponent gets stabbed, unless his opponent just drops dead immediately. So the reason it was called the knight thrust in English is apparently it's mentioned that this technique was more effective at night. I mean, maybe? I don't know. I'm a little skeptical of that. Maybe it was just called the knight thrust because it was sneaky, but I guess maybe if you had a hard time seeing your opponent in the dark, you'd be like less likely to see them suddenly drop over and like fall to the floor to thrust you. But it's a very, very committed attack, and it is kind of the thing where you're just trying to catch your opponent off guard, go underneath their defensive posture, and just land that one thrust to kind of end it. And of course, it would look very, very skillful too. Backed up against a wall, yeah, I could kind of see that. It does seem to be the kind of thing that would happen in a desperate situation. I also have seen a British British source that warns fencers of French fencers doing this technique and it being kind of suicidal. They were basically like, hey, you're going to fight some French people. They're going to try this really crazy thing that you got to be ready for. It's probably going to get them killed, but it's going to get you killed if you don't know what's happening either. So it's pretty interesting technique, at least. And it does seem at least to be pretty popular, even though it's very dramatic and potentially risky, because it's a thing all the way back from Italian rapier. You can find Italian rapier treatises in like the 1600s showing what is clearly a passata sotto. And it's something that really stayed popular over time.
It's so neat too, because I was just, I don't know, like doing cursory reading and stuff, and this position, the lunge, not necessarily where his body is now, but you see it in ballet too, which, you know, was very big in France and Italy during this time period. So it would make sense. Doesn't make sense, but it does. Like, I was reading Ruth Goodman's like mannerisms book or whatever, and she went into this whole spiel where she was discussing how swordsmanship was so heavily influenced during this time period by the ballet scene. But this is very much an Italian port de bras, like a carriage of the arms position, the lunge. And then from there, you would like cambre forward, you would bend forward, and then you would rotate all the way around, like extending back. So it's like, I don't know, it's neat just to see these constant overlays.
Yeah, I'd be very interested to see that. I'm definitely not like a dance expert or anything, but I'd be very interested to see how the body mechanics overlap, because I totally believe that it could work that way.
I can tell you for a fact that so I danced for a very long time, and I haven't done it in like 10 years, like seriously. I started taking Chris's rapier class before COVID hit, and I swear to God, all of the muscles that hurt the next day were all of the muscles that I used while I was dancing. It was all of the inner thigh, it was the lower back, it was the core. But like in longsword, it's very different, right? Like longsword, I find myself engaging upper abs and like quads and like more shoulders, but everything rapier was so dance heavy. It was very bizarre.
So that's very interesting. You've brought up something else very similar I've noticed with one-handed swords, which you get people who are experienced longsword fencers or just in really good shape in general, and I always hear the same thing when someone starts fencing a one-handed sword for the first time, be it a saber or a rapier or whatever, which is, oh my god, these weird muscles I never use are really sore all of the sudden. It happens with everybody. With saber in particular, it's forearm muscles between the wrist and the elbow. I hear people all the time say that that's where they're feeling the strain. and that's not something you typically work out with longsword or anything else, really, right? Like
Climbing's the only one I can think of.
I can see that. Yeah, like rock climbing.
Yeah. Oh, we should ping Elijah at some point and see, because he's an avid climber.
Yeah, there we go. That's a HEMA trip right there.
So cool though. Yeah, it's neat because it's very much like the inner. Okay, so I'm gonna have to do this now, so y'all can feel it, I guess. Like, we're gonna have to do an amateur-ass ballet class, so you guys can fully experience what these like rotations and muscles feel like, as opposed to what you use while you're longswording, because it's totally different.
You should do a class on that. I would totally do a ballet and swordsmanship class. You should lead that.
Okay, I'll have to write it up. The modern dance one was cool, but it's like, that was more of a full body workout than ballet specific. So.
But yeah, that was actually the last slide I had. I just had a little end slide where I just gathered up some cool saber images to close it out.
Beautiful. What saber is yours that you use?
For HEMA?
Yeah.
So mine is a infantry version of a British 1796 light cavalry saber. The 1796 light cavalry saber was very, very popular and kind of stylish in Britain at the time, like I mentioned. And a bunch of officers started commissioning, like on their own dime, infantry-sized versions of it, to the point where it becomes a very common sword where you can find nowadays, where they were just like, hey, I want the cool sword the cavalry guys have, but, you know, just make it like shorter and make the blade a little lighter so I can like use it on foot. And it happened so much that officers were spending their own money at this, that in 1803, the British Army actually came out with the 1803 pattern flank officer saber, which is basically a infantry 1796 saber with a different hilt. It just has a slightly more complicated hilt, but in every other way, it's like clearly what the officers were like wanting.
That's so cool.
But yeah, I'm not in a rush, guys. If there's anything else you want to talk about or any other questions you have for me, like, feel free to shoot away. I can talk about sabers all day.
I do have to run, but I want to say this was amazing, and thank you so much for A, volunteering to do this, and B, putting together such a well thought out and collective presentation.
Yeah, no problem. I'm happy to.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, guys. I gotta go, but I'm very happy that we did this. This is amazing. P.S. Tomorrow at 8, the normal Gemeindesrechten time, we do have Tim Hall leading a talk on ring-in and wrestling in all of its contexts, okay? He is known as the source, quote unquote, for ring-in and anything wrestling in HEMA. So if you have the time, by all means, sit in on that. I imagine it's going to be absolutely fascinating. Travis, thank you so much again. This was seriously great.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for coming out.
Absolutely. All right. Night, guys.
All right. Good night, Marlene.